Greetings. History of Economic Thought 2. This is the lecture on competition, part 2. In our previous lecture, we were discussing perfect competition versus rivalrous competition and asking how it was that perfect competition came to be thought of as the dominant model of competition. What we're going to talk about today will change slightly. We'll talk about imperfect competition and monopolistic competition. I think you can see this board here. There's a bit of glare. I'm trying this one sitting down. You didn't get to see the outtakes from the previous video recording, such as the one where the whole board fell over. But we'll try this one sitting down, see if this will work. Well, how is it that perfect competition actually become the dominant view of what competition is, the orthodoxy? If you remember, what we argued previously, was that rivalrous competition is the process of competing, whereas what we now call the perfectly competitive model is actually the equilibrium towards which that process would take us. Two different things. But somehow, perfect competition became synonymous with competition. The perfectly competitive equilibrium did. Well, here's that story, and it ranges through another set of models, which is imperfect and monopolistic competition. And the idea is that there are two well-defined neoclassical equilibrium models. On the one hand, there's the model of monopoly, one seller with market power. That was defined by Cournot in his one seller model. On the other hand, the polar case of Cournot's perfectly competitive equilibrium, in which you have many firms. In Cournot's story, n goes to infinity when we've got arbitrarily many firms when we have perfect competition. Two very well-defined models. In the middle, we have duopoly, triopoly, things like that. Those are not well-defined. Are players choosing quantity? Are they choosing price? Well, the outcome depends very much on what the choice variables are. Now, we have these two well-defined models, but they very poorly describe most observed situations. First of all, firms do have influence. We don't see monopolies. We don't just see a single firm in the market, but we do see that firms have an influence on price. Goods are certainly not homogeneous, and in many cases. And so how do we account for what we actually see in the market? Well, this became a question for economists. And one of the first people to deal with this question was Piero Scarafa, with an alternative viewpoint. Scarafa was an Italian who was at Cambridge University in the UK. I'll get his name down here. Piero Scarafa. And he lived 1898 to 1983, Cambridge University in the UK. And he was working with the Marshallians, but he looked at Marshall's decreasing cost industry. He was a man who was skeptical of the market system. He looked at Marshall's argument for a decreasing cost industry and said, there's something not right about this. Marshall's decreasing cost industry, the external economies don't make sense. It must be the case that one big firm could somehow reap those gains and dominate that market, effectively a natural monopoly. Scarafa also said, in the real world, we don't see lots of little teeny tiny firms. What we actually see are big firms. So I'm skeptical of the competitive model. Monopolistic tendencies, not competition, are what explain what we see in the market. Now, one of his students, Joan Robinson, also a student of John Maynard Keynes, began picking up this approach. He encouraged Robinson, and she began developing what was called a model of imperfect competition. I'm mentioning them briefly because they are both important people. Joan Robinson is an individual who, she lived 1903 to 1983 and develops the model of imperfect competition. She's also a Cambridge University professor. An early Keynesian, one of the very most important ones in promoting the Keynesian ideas, but later she and Piero Scarafa become leader of the neo-Ricardian approach, or often now called post-Keynesian approach. This is an anti-neoclassical, anti-marginal revolution school that really wants to dismiss much of the economics we've been talking about. She was a very tough woman, troublemaker, combative. The saying, well-behaved women don't make history, that applies to her. Well, she's inspired by Scarafa's critique. He urges her to work on this, and in 1933 she publishes a book, The Economics of Imperfect Competition. It's a model in which there's a downward sloping demand curve for the firm's product. There are many firms, but each firm has a downward sloping average cost curve, and there's a kind of strange sort of competition going on there. Now, she was attempting to critique the Marshallian neoclassical economics, but she soon repudiates her own work and moves on to much more radical stances. She's into a very radical kind of Keynesianism and even a reconsideration of Marx and socialism, which she's favorable to. And that becomes this later post-Keynesian school. So we're not going to say very much about her except to mention her, and we may come back to them. But we'll move across the Atlantic to the United States, where another economist picks up this story at the same time and develops a very similar, almost identical model, the model of monopolistic competition. And so this will be the story of Edward Chamberlain. Edward Chamberlain, an American, lived, 1899 to 1967. He was a student at University of Iowa, where he studied with Frank Knight. He then went to University of Michigan and eventually earned his PhD at Harvard University. In 1933, he also published a book, same year as Joan Robinson, and his book was The Theory of Monopolistic Competition. And so this is his achievement, monopolistic competition. And it's not influenced by Scarafa. It's not meant to be an attack on capitalism or an attack on the Marshallian model, but rather it's inspired by another American, his instructor at Harvard, Frank Tausig. Tausig was an important economist, put his name down. His teacher, Frank Tausig, at Harvard, he lived 1859 to 1940, got into a debate with A.C. Pegu over the pricing of railroads. What explains railroad prices? There is first-class travel, there's second-class travel, etc. Different prices for tickets on the same train. Pegu had argued that this is price discrimination, and Tausig said no, it's joint production of different commodities. First-class travel and second-class travel are different goods. And so you've got two separate products with one set of costs involved in producing them. Well, the debate goes on in the literature, and Pegu actually wins this debate. That he argues that it is simply a price discrimination. Chamberlain thinks Tausig was probably right. He came close, but his model didn't work. But if we differentiate those markets, the different products, those should give a slight element of monopoly. Then we can support Tausig's model, and firms will be competing, but they have characteristics. These goods have characteristics that make them different. So firms in general will have goods that are slightly different. Let me give you an example of what I mean. We can talk about, for example, trail running shoes. And trail running shoes are a good, but they're not all quite the same. There's a Salomon and there's a Saucony. Don't know if you can see those, but there they are. They're both trail running shoes, great tread, but they're not the same thing. They're competing, they're not identical, they're both pretty good shoes. This is the kind of thing he's talking about. they have some product differentiation, but they're all in the same market. Well, he comes up with a model then and calls it monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is the story in which we have the following characteristics. Let's see if we can avoid knocking over the blackboard or the whiteboard here. And we'll get imperfect competition because that's Joan Robinson. In fact, let's start from scratch. There we go. Almost time to wash the eraser. Monopolistic competition. And the first characteristic is that we have many firms, a very large number of firms. Great. Well, what does that buy us? What do we mean by large? Well, it's a big enough number of firms that each firm acts independently and understands that it won't have a big effect on the other firms when it makes a choice. Unlike, say, a duopoly. If you think back to the Cournot duopoly, where the choice of a firm had a very big influence on the other firm's reaction function, here, there's no discernible effect of making a decision. So, many firms, and we have free entry and exit. Great. Well, so far it looks just like the monopoly model. What else do we have? How about heterogeneous products? Now it doesn't look like the monopoly model. The products are different, as in the Salomon versus the Saucony trail running shoe. They're in the same market. They're both pretty good substitutes for each other, but they're not identical. So as he points out, it could be physical traits, could be the location, could be something about the type of service being offered, some sort of imagined differences. Is there really any difference between Pepsi and Coke? Well, some people there might be. I can't tell the difference. Don't want to try. And then finally, a fourth thing that comes from this is that the sellers are price searchers. That is to say, they have some market power. They have an ability to change the price without losing all of the business that they're receiving. They can raise it or lower it a bit without losing all their customers. Great. Well, that gives us a way of modeling all of this. And so let's do that. We'll clean this up and we'll try drawing a graph. I'm doing this at perhaps a disadvantage because of the angle, but I think we'll get this right. And we'll put on this axis dollars per unit of output. And on this axis, we get output, our usual price and quantity space. Great, I think you can see that. And I'll draw a demand curve. Great, there's the demand curve. But what demand curve is that? That's the demand curve for the firm's product, not the whole market, but just this firm. So we could think that could be Saucony running shoes. Great. All right. Well, that gives us then a marginal revenue curve for that firm. We'll run it through there, and there's our marginal revenue, halfway, of course. And so we've got that in there. That's for the firm. And what does this mean? Well, it means that there's a big demand curve for this category of products, trail running shoes, and this firm makes up a small part of the market. So there's something with the big full supply, not supply, but demand story, and this is a part of that demand curve. Great. We could think of that as being things like Coke, or some particular kind of toothpaste, or it could be gasoline from the Kroger station, and yet there's also a few others as an Admiral and some other ones down the street in Hillsdale. Great. Well, let's go ahead now and draw the firm's cost curves in. And we'll see if I can get this thing without making too much of a mess. Let's draw the firm's average cost curve and the firm's marginal cost curve should intersect at the lowest point of that average cost curve, as we've argued. So we'll draw that in. There's the firm's average cost and the firm's marginal cost. Great. Well, what does the firm do? The firm looks at the market and says, aha, marginal revenue, marginal cost, right there, and produces this much of the good, we'll call it little q prime, and charges this price for it. Great. Is the firm making a profit? Well, there's the average cost of production for that firm, average cost prime, and there's the P prime that they're charging. Looks like they are making positive profit per unit. Great. Profit is greater than zero in this case. So what happens? Well, basically, similar firms will enter this market. It's attractive. There's free entry and exit, and firms can enter with a different product that competes. So we had Saucony, Salomon enters the market, Brooks enters the market, Nike enters the market, and they begin producing trail running shoes. And so what happens is that as they enter, the demand for this particular firm's product is being sucked off by those other firms. Some of it goes to Nike or to Saucony or Salomon, whoever. So this demand curve then begins shrinking, so long as there's positive profit. When does that stop? Well, it stops when the demand curve has fallen to the point where, let's say it happens to be right there. There's our marginal, this is kind of crazy to draw, but there's the demand curve. There's the new marginal revenue curve. Hopefully you are watching this, hopefully you're not colorblind and you're watching in color. This is now red. And the red shows the point at which, right there is where our marginal cost and our marginal revenue are crossing. And that should be the point at which there's the new price, P double prime, the new output, Q double prime, and we have the new equilibrium. I'm hoping you can see that. Great. Entry by new firms reduces the demand for the existing firm's product. That keeps going until profit is equal to zero, and then we are in the long run equilibrium position. Price equals average cost. There's no more profit. Great. That's the model. Now, let's analyze it and see what we can get from this. I'm going to erase and clean this up so we can actually see what's going on. And let's do that. Great. Now, we're going to look at the long run position where there is zero profit. Let's draw this back here. We'll get our, let's assume, let's not just assume, let's have a straight line. We'll draw that in. That's pretty straight. What do you think this is, art class? Average cost, here's our marginal cost. And remember, we were at a point at which the average cost curve had the demand curve somewhere like that, back there. Great. So that's our little position where we finally ended up, and we'll just call that, again, Q double prime. That's the final output. Now, what would happen if this were a perfectly competitive market? Well, in a perfectly competitive market, of course, in the long run, every firm is producing at that point on the curve. So I'm going to draw that one in, Q perfect competition. Now, here's how we can analyze this. That's the lowest possible cost of production right there, given the plant size of the firm. And remember, that's long run, so that takes into account the amount of capital being used, so the size of the firm. The argument that many people look at this and have made after he laid out this model, after Chamberlain laid out this model, was that that position right there is clearly suboptimal. It's suboptimal. And in fact, that's called social excess capacity, because you could produce this product more cheaply and you're not doing it. If you expanded output to there, but of course the demand didn't warrant it. Well, obviously, product differentiation is wasteful. It's bad. That's what a number of analysts concluded. And they argued that advertising, brand names, small physical differences, those things are clearly bad for consumers. Consumers would be better off if we moved here. You don't need 12 kinds of deodorant, says Comrade Sanders. Chuck Schumer used to campaign on his big issues. We have too many kinds of cereals, and cereals have monopoly power, therefore, and that federal government needs to crack down. Your textbook says, I think foolishly, the reader will note that there are, what does it say? Uninformative television ads, often tasteless, well known to every TV viewer. Well, they must work. Allegedly, these things, product differentiation and advertising, provide no value to the viewer or to the buyer. They are simply trying to increase demand. Hang on, that's an oxymoron if you think about what it means. Demand is the value that people attach to something. If you've increased it, you've increased how people regard it, how they value it. Implicit here, when people say these things, is an unjustified notion of what demand should be, what the viewer wants, what the observer wants it to be, rather than the observer believes that he or she knows better than the consumer. Chamberlain himself, when he developed this model, said, look, this is not a criticism of capitalism. This is not suboptimal, but rather differentiation must be providing additional value to the consumer. Yep, it's costly, he says, but the excess capacity is a cost consumers are willing to bear to enjoy the advantages of the differentiated products. It's simply, if they didn't, they could simply not pay more for those products, and they could go to competitors, and we would end up with that point right there, homogeneous products, perfect competition. So think of it this way. We could all have cheaper clothing if we would all quit dressing up and we'd all wear the same clothing. We'll just wear little Chairman Mao suits, as they did in China during the Cultural Revolution. Well, great. So that's the model of monopolistic competition and how it has been interpreted. How are we to regard this? Well, first of all, the Chicago School's viewpoint, promoted by Milton Friedman, is that this is a wrong approach. What this is a mishmash of two different things. It's a false quest for realism. Milton Friedman argues that models should abstract, they should be stylized, and they should make useful points, and being realistic is beside the point. This is a false quest for realism. The two workhorse models for Milton Friedman were the perfectly competitive market and the monopoly market. And he says, suppose we wanted to, let's say, analyze handmade sandwiches down the street. For some purposes, for some questions, all we need is supply and demand. We would want to use the perfectly competitive market model. And for other purposes, something about their pricing, we might want to use the monopoly model. So these are just tools that we use for different jobs. That's Friedman's point. But this is like trying to take a wrench and a saw and make a saw and a wrench all in one. It's a bastard model. That approach is still taught at Chicago, although they do, of course, now they actually do teach the monopolistic competitive model. There's another criticism of this, and it comes from Israel Kerzner and the Austrians. And that is that, well, first of all, it entails a contradiction. It claims that there's free entry and exit, but obviously it's not completely free entry and exit. Great, we've got these different products, and they aren't the same. If you prefer this one, well, the competitors can't make it. They can make something that's similar, but they're not identical. So it's not truly free entry and exit. Free entry, I should say. There must be some kind of barriers to entry in this story. And even worse, from the Austrian viewpoint, is that this is another equilibrium model. It doesn't fix the problems of the perfectly competitive model. It simply is a different equilibrium. It still misses the dynamic character of what's going on in the economy. You haven't really explained the competitive process that is happening. Competition is a process, not an end state. It's a tragedy that equilibrium from this or from perfect competition becomes identified as being what competition is. Those are just different things. Ironically, it's the things that make competition possible that end up being called monopolistic. So it doesn't make a great deal of sense from the Austrian standpoint. Well, why do we even care about this model? It's actually, if you move into graduate school, into a PhD program, you'll find that the monopolistic competition model is used in things like trade models and in models of international trade. And it's used in macroeconomic models oftentimes, new Keynesian models, because it will give a certain degree of price stickiness. It will help to model that. And so as a modeling assumption, monopolistic competition is now becoming a part of a fairly common tool set, for better or worse. Great. Well, we've covered the story of competition, and we've covered factor pricing, and we've covered the marginal revolution ideas of consumer utility, how that drives everything. Next, we're going to apply all of this, and we're going to talk about socialism. We'll return to that in our next video.